Hello, everyone, and welcome to Pocket Size Bio with Dr. Casco. In this video, we're going to continue Campbell Biology, Chapter 1, Core Concept 1.2. Okay, we should be finishing this chapter with this video. All right, so let's get started. So the next core theme that we're talking about is evolution accounts for the unity and diversity of life. Okay, so evolution in itself, right, kind of gives the puts everything in perspective if you want to talk about biology. Okay, an understanding of evolution makes sense of everything we know about life on Earth. Okay, and scientists, as we're going to see in the chapters on fossils, scientists have accumulated a great um, deal of fossils, ultimately creating a fossil record, right? A timeline, so to say, right? That kind of shows how life has been evolving for billions of years, right? Right. And so there's an understanding that there's a lot of diversity within past organisms and present organisms, but at the same time, there's unity, right? Unity is still present between such diversity of life, right? Because there's a lot of shared features. And I'll get into that in a little bit. Just to formally talk about what evolution is as a concept, it is a process of biological change in which species accumulate differences from their ancestors as they adapt to different environments over time. Okay? Over time. And this idea of evolution, right, can explain difference between species, right? Diversity, all derived from a common ancestor, and at the same time, you do see traits being shared amongst the variety of life. Hence, the idea of unity. Again, from the concept of a common ancestor. There is a myriad of evidence, right? There's an abundance of evidence. If I'm saying this correctly, Theodosius Dobzhansky, okay, a biologist, states nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. We're going to talk about that a little bit later in the video. So, having the idea of evolution and the diversity of life, of course, scientists need to classify and organize all the different organisms in this world, right? Classifying the diversity of life. Uh, Approximately 8.5 million species have been named and identified to better create a better understanding of organization and classification. We, implement this idea of a two-part system. Um, a genus species nomenclature of naming organisms, Homo sapiens as an example, right? Homo being the genus, sapiens being the species identifier. Within this diversity of life, just to give you some numbers, there's fungi have been around the hundred thousands of species have been identified. Plants, 290,000. Insects have been, if not the most, I can say, plus a million different types of insects have been identified, right? So there's a great diversity of life. And of course, having so much diversity requires, having organization, okay, and having a sense of classifying them into, shared features. One of the broadest levels of classification are the domains, right? And we have three domains of life. Scientists tend to group organisms, right, based on similarities, right? Structure, function of a certain characteristic that they have. And definitely DNA being such a powerful method of categorizing, of classifying organisms because, sequence similarity, you have a higher likelihood of having shared traits. Okay, and it's a more modern approach. The three domains, more specifically, you have archaea, bacteria, and eukarya. Of course, we get into these in a lot more detail, but these are some panels so you can get a sense of how they look like. you have the domain bacteria, and amongst bacteria domain, it branches out into several kingdoms of bacteria. Okay, you have several forms and features. Here you can see some rod-shaped structures of this bacterial cell, incredibly small, 2 micrometers. You have the domain Okyra, right? Which share some features with bacteria that they're prokaryotes, but they also have features very similar to eukaryotes, right? So they're in their own little domain. They one of the distinguishing features of Echiura is that they live in extreme environments, right? Salty lakes, incredibly high temperature, springs, right? Archaea. Again, very similar in size to bacteria. And then you have the 4 kingdoms, the domain Elkyra, which is broken down into 4 kingdoms. Okay, one of the distinguishing feature that could be used to um, identify these different groups, right? These different kingdoms within the domain Alkyra is the way that they obtain nutrition, right? Plants being the photosynthesizers, right? These autotrophs convert light energy to chemical energy. You have kingdom fungi, which basically can absorb nutrients outside of their bodies, right, in the soil or decomposing bodies. Organisms, kingdom animalia, they basically ingest other organisms, and kingdom protista, where you have mostly unicellular eukaryotes, right? Um, or you can have a simple multicellular um, protists also. Okay, these are currently, still being studied in ways to improve this group. It's quite broad. You have some subgroups within this kingdom Protista, which have features of animals, have features of fungi, have features of plants. So scientists still debate, right? And there's a lot of research being done on how to classify these organisms more accurately. Okay. All right, continuing on with this concept of evolution and diversity of life and unity. So, unity in the diversity of life. Of course, there are some distinguishing features among all these organisms that gives us some form of being related, right? If we talk about vertebrates, right, there we have a skeletal system, and even the skeletal systems amongst different animals and DNA sequences shows some similarity in terms of the structure and the origin of these structures, right? Homologous structures of anatomical similarities. Okay, so it's quite interesting that evolution can explain these similarities and differences at the same time. Take a look. Here's another example of a cilia found in a paramecium, okay, a protist. And then we also have cilia in our body, in our windpipe, right? And if you get a cross section of these two cilia from completely different organisms, you see that the protein structures and the fibers that compose the cilia are almost identical. Okay, so that can show that structure. You have some similarity in terms of structure amongst different organisms. Okay. And again, in another example, you're studying history of life on Earth. You have researchers that are, fossil collection, right? They've unearthed different fossils. Here you have South Africa. You have a sample of a Homo naledi, an extinct relative of Homo sapiens, right? Discovered underground in an underground cave, very well preserved. You have a whole composition of the organism, right? And very similar to modern humans in terms of their skeletal system. Okay. So this idea of of evolution, comes about with Charles Darwin in the theory of natural selection. Right? We've all heard of Charles Darwin, who's an English naturalist, and he published a very famous book on the origin of species by means of natural selection in 1859. And this book provided two um, concepts, 2 main points, right? As species adapt to different environments over time, they accumulate differences from their ancestors. Other known as descent with modifications. Modern descendants, they're collecting differences, or I don't want to say collecting, but they're accumulating differences, changes in their bodies to adapt to a new environment, which will ultimately look different from their ancestor. Okay. And number two, proposal of natural selection as the agent of cause for descent of modification. We're going to take a look at natural selection in a bit. Okay. So these concepts, right, have some parameters. First, individuals in a population, they tend to vary in their traits, right? They're not 100% identical, right? Um, so they vary in the traits, and these traits, of course, tend to be heritable, passed down from parent to offspring, parent to offspring. Second, a population can produce far more offspring than what can survive in the environment, right? So a population can produce far more offspring than can survive to produce offspring of their own, right? With more individuals in an environment, right, it becomes more difficult to survive because there's an increase in competition. Competition is inevitable. Okay. And then those species that are suited better to those environments, right? They're more adapted to their particular circumstances, are more likely to survive, reproduce, and pass down these traits, ultimately obtaining this adaptation, right? To survive in this particular environment. Okay. Common adaptations among birds, okay, among birds that eat hard seeds would be an especially strong, particularly strong beak, right? Okay. Continue to the next little panel page here. Here's a visual representation of natural selection. Okay, so Darwin, he reasoned on how evolution occurs, right? He wanted to explain how it occurs. Again, just I mentioned before, individuals with um, better suited traits, right? Sorry about this little notes here. Better suited traits are far better, fare better in their environment, right? These individuals are more likely to survive and reproduce over many generations, right? A higher frequency of these individuals, right, in the population will have this advantageous trait. That will ultimately lead to the adaptation. Okay. So in itself, natural selection, nature will select, which individual is better suited for the environment. So nature selects the propagation of certain traits. All right, just to get a visual representation here, you have a population of beetles here that serve as prey for this particular bird here, right? And since you have variation among traits within these beetles, you have light-colored beetles, you have these whitish gray, and then you have these um, uh, darker toned gray beetles here. Of course, just visually, it's easier for the bird to see the lighter colored. Okay, so nature is selecting those that are a lot more difficult to see, to spot. So over time, you know, individuals with that darker trait are more likely to survive. Okay, they don't get eaten, they're not easily visible to the predator. Okay, so in a nutshell, you have this idea of natural selection, ultimately leading to a variation of life. So, as a result, we have so much diversity of life with shared characteristics, similar characteristics, a little bit of diversity there, that scientists come up with this concept of the tree of life, phylogenetic trees, that we're going to see much later. Okay. Bats have wings, but they're not birds, but they have this structure to fly, right? Bats are mammals. Okay. Bone structure represents similarity with human arms. You see how the bones are, okay, within the flap of the wing of the bat, right? The bone structure represents similarity. Again, and more specifically on the organization of the bone structures, right? Every little fingers, you have the wrist bones, you have your whole arm, right? The organization. You have the radius and the ulna, you have the humerus, right? In that same structural organization. Very similar to a human arm, to whale flippers and other organisms. Okay, so they must have had a common ancestor, right? In other words, a prototype animal, which all mammals descended. Okay, so again, it's just a matter of time where you're getting changes of the population due to nature, ultimately leading to descent with modification to this diversity of life. Okay. Some reasons for this happening is that the ancestral species populations, right, the common ancestor, the population could have fragmented into different environments, right, little subpopulations, each having a different environment, different environmental pressures, right, which would kind of force the population to change in a particular way. Famous example, as we all know, are the finches of Galapagos Islands. We're going to take a look. Okay. Again, similar situation. In this case, Darwin collected species 1835, Galapagos Islands. He went to go observe all the organisms there, right? 900 kilometers out of the mainland, right? You have young volcanic islands having formed. Okay. Many different types of birds, of finches. Okay. And you have an ancestral finch coming in from the mainland. Okay. This ancestral finch population diversified, to these islands to find different food sources. There's different food sources amongst these islands, so it made them kind of change their beak formation. Okay. Scientists create this relationship into these tree-like forms that you see here. Okay. Each little twig that you see on this tree represents a species, as you can see here, right? Different types of species. And if you go down to the past, right, extends back to time, right? Back in time through ancestral species. Okay. Different species diversity, they do have common ancestors at different points in their evolutionary, you know, uh, timeline, right? And you can notice these little this little branching out here. Each little point here is referred to as a common ancestor. It's a node, right, in which these species are related. So the woodpecker finch, the small tree finch, they share a common ancestor. At this node, all of these four finches share a common ancestor at this node, right? Ultimately, this whole a tree, representation is referred to as a phylogenetic tree. Okay. Species having more recent common ancestors are more related. Okay. And then, of course, if we going further back, you can see uh, finches relating to other birds and other birds, right? And we can even go back further to all living organisms, right? One of the key points in doing that is the genetic code and DNA, right? Ultimately, going back to some of the first living organisms 3.5 billion years ago, which are prokaryotic cells. Okay. There's some questions on the concept checks that you can take a look. All right. I want to go into now concept 1.3 or a third concept check. In studying nature, scientists form and test hypotheses. This is something that should be familiar to all of us, especially if you're in undergrad. What is science and the nature of science, right? Science is a way of knowing, it's an approach to understand the natural world. In other words, to know, right, the natural world. At the heart of science, of course, is inquiry, right? You want to search for information, you want to explain natural phenomenon through observations, right? Scientists use a process of inquiry that includes, if I can say, requires observations, right? Carefully looking at something, right? At your natural environment. From these observations, we question, we make hypotheses, and we form testable, logical explanations to what we're observing, right? And then we test if if our explanation is valid or not. Okay, as a scientist, you must repeat your experiment. You must test your explanation many times until the hypothesis is finely tuned, right? It all begins with observation. Okay, and of course, in biology and other sciences, begins with observation. Within biology, of course, we have many tools, as in other natural sciences, to help us with our observations, to help us with our measurements. Indispensable to biology is the microscope. Okay, many types of microscope that we're going to talk about later. Cameras, thermometers, rulers, anything that extends our senses is a tool, right? Tool of measurement. Okay, and exploring nature, biologists also rely extremely on scientific literature. I want to point, not just biology, just every scientist. We need to know previous literature, what scientists in the past have done, what have they discovered, so we can kind of build on that, build on past studies, existing knowledge, and try to add to that body of knowledge. Of course, literature, publications, academic journals. Nowadays, we can find it at our fingertips, on our phones. We can go to Google Scholar and so forth, and just find any publication, right? On previous studies. Incredibly important because it helps you create your hypothesis based on what has been known already. Even if you want to create something new or that is going in a different direction, right? Or you want to make a new idea, you still need to know the literature. Okay. So after that, gathering and analyzing data, right? Data are recorded observations. So you need to make critical observations, meticulous observations, right? This is a form of data, items of information, okay, um, which scientific inquiry is based. Sorry about the notes there. Okay. Very famous example that we all know. Jane Goodall collected qualitative data, the naturalist, zoologist studying chimpanzee behavior over a decade, a long period of time. Jane Goodall has studied chimpanzees. Okay. Again, qualitative data, observations, recording these observations, for example, behavior. This qualitative data could also be numerical, right? How often does this same behavior occur? And it can turn into quantitative data, right? You can have a set of mixed methods there. Frequency of behavior. Numerical methods can be analyzed with statistics, right? Mathematical methods. So ultimately you want to collect, right? You want to have a collecting and analyzing observations can lead to important conclusions based on a logic called inductive reasoning. Okay, based on inductive reasoning. Okay. Ultimately, this idea of inductive reasoning, right, comes from deriving generalizations from observations. Okay. After many, 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 many experiments, right, thought process, um, we can establish, right, that something will occur. The sun will rise tomorrow, right? Organisms are all made up of cells. Okay. So far, we've studied a great variety of life. To date, we have not seen at least I hope, that organisms that have been studied are all composed of cells, right? So that idea, leading to important conclusion, is based on a logic called inductive reasoning. Okay? Much of the sciences that we do is based on inductive reasoning. Okay. All right. Continuing on, talking a little bit more about hypotheses, which we should be familiar with. Forming and testing hypotheses, right? So answering questions usually involves forming and testing logical explanations, right? Called hypotheses. Hypotheses are not just some random um, explanation that you throw out. It is logical, right? It is based on observation, on certain assumptions. It is based on previous information from the literature, right? That you can lead to a testable prediction. And to test it, you would do experiments to test the hypothesis, right? Very simple example. Desk lamp is plugged in, but the light doesn't turn on, right? Trial and error, experimentation and thinking, right? Going back to the beginning, what is working, what is not working. Okay. So just to kind of go to this panel here, observation, the desk lamp doesn't work. Question, why doesn't the lamp work, right? One hypothesis could be the bulb is burned out, so the light doesn't turn on. Or another hypothesis could be the bulb is improperly screwed in. So if I were to, reinstall the bulb properly, then I can fix the problem, do the actual, prediction, and then the lamp doesn't work. Hypothesis not supported. So you oftentimes, many, many times, would go back to the hypothesis, go back to the experiment to try to fix, or to the prediction, to see what is the problem. Let's go back to the other hypothesis. Replacing the bulb will fix the problem. Then you execute it. Your experiment, you replace the bulb, the lamp works. So the lamp is burned out. Okay. Very important to note. It says, although a hypothesis can never be proved beyond all doubt, testing it in various ways can significantly increase our confidence in its validity. Often, rounds of hypothesis formulation and testing lead to a scientific consensus, the shared conclusion of many scientists that a particular hypothesis explains the known data well and stands up to experimental testing. Okay. I like this kind of first sentence there. Although a hypothesis can never be proven beyond all doubt, right? Testing it in various ways increases the confidence in its validity, right? All right. So this kind of leads into this deductive reasoning, a type of logic that flows from the general to the specific. If I do this, then this should occur, right? So this type of predictive reasoning is used a lot in hypotheses. Okay. Some features of hypotheses, they could always be changed. You can always create more additional hypotheses. One thing to note though, yes, hypotheses can never be proven as 100% true, right? You just obtain more validity. All right. As we know also in science, right? Questions that can and cannot be addressed by science. Science is a powerful approach to learn about nature, but questions must be testable. You cannot do a scientific study about the presence of ghosts, angels, the supernatural, and so forth. Okay. So it is limited to things that are testable. Okay. And interestingly, as you dive into the scientific process, right, which we know, the scientific method, it doesn't necessarily follow, and oftentimes it does not follow a straight line from hypothesis to prediction and experimentation, results, conclusion. Many times you're going to be jumping around the different phases of this process, right, of the scientific method. You could be testing the ideas, um, jumping into interpreting the results, getting into, benefits and outcome, community. You bounce back into the observation or the hypothesis, creating new things, right? So um, it's quite entangled, right? Rather than just being strictly linear. Okay. The book gives a nice case study about the coat coloration of in mouse populations, right? A case study in scientific inquiry. Okay, back in the when I first talked about the chapter, right? You have these two mice, right? Populations that within the mainland, you have mice, an inland population that have dark fur, and you have those that are in the beach population that have a more grayish white light fur population, right? As you can see in these two different areas. So again, what accounts for variation of color pattern variation within the same species of Paramycus polionotus, right? And sorry, this should be italicized. Oops, this should be italicized. Okay, so we have this species here that is prey to these particular predators, right? Hawks, foxes, owls, coyotes. They're visual hunters. All these organisms are visual hunters, right? So the idea of camouflage, hypothesis stated by Francis Sumner, 1920s, right, was established. And then in 2010, uh, Hoppy Hoestra, if I'm saying that correctly, tested the prediction in a field experiment where she tried this out. She did controlled experiments, a control group versus an experimental group. And of course, in every experiment, you need to have certain variables that you want to keep stable, right? And one variable that you want to change. We all know these are the independent and, of course, the variable that is being affected by the experiment, right? Independent variable being the manipulated variable, dependent variable being the affected variable. Okay, only if one variable should be changed, or else how would you know what is really the cause of the results, right? So you want to be critical on your experimental setup, right? Only changing one variable. Okay, controlled variables are those that you basically keep constant amongst the groups, right? You would you want to minimize their effects amongst the experimental and the control group. Okay, so these scientists they tested the wanting to know or understand why this is occurring amongst the hair color. All right, and she um, basically had this particular layout, right? So as we're going to see in this in the textbook, you have these little panels, inquiry panels. Does camouflage affect predation rates on two populations of mice? Right. So you have these scientists tested the hypothesis that coat coloration provides camouflage that protects beach and inland populations of this particular species from predation in their habitats. The researchers spray painted mouse models with light and dark color patterns that match those of the beach and inline mice, and placed the models with each of the patterns in both habitats. The next morning, they counted damaged or missing models. Okay, and these are the results that you see below. For each habitat, the researchers calculated the percentage of attacked models that were camouflaged or non-camouflaged. In both habitats, the models were whose pattern did not match their surroundings suffered much higher predation than did the camouflaged models. In the beach habitat, okay, percent of attacked models, right? So look clearly at the data. Dark models had a higher percentage of being attacked, non-camouflage. You had your camouflage or your control, and then you had the opposite situation here. Light models in the inland habitat were had a higher predation percentage of attacked models. Okay, conclusion, the results are consistent with the researchers' prediction that mouse models with camouflage coloration would be attacked less often than non-camouflage mouse models. Okay, so this is a very simple experiment to give you a sense of the nature of science and the scientific method. All right. Okay. One last thing that we briefly discussed, theories in science. Again, scientific theories, all right, they're broader in scope and hypothesis. They're general enough to spin off many new testable hypotheses, but they have a great body of evidence to support it. Okay. The cell theory is an example. Incredible amount of data that shows living organisms are made up of cells. Okay. Evolutionary theory. Okay. Again, substantial amount of data, different forms of data that support this evidence. It is possible that theories can change or get updated as new information and discoveries accumulate. Theories can change, right? Bacteria and archaea used to be in the same group based on the newer technology and observations. They are separated into different their own groups, right? Based on their distinguishing features. Okay. That's the last part of chapter 1. Science benefits from a cooperative approach. Sorry about that. And diverse viewpoints. Okay, just go a little bit higher here. Scientists and science is an intensely social activity, right? Um, very common to work in teams, work in groups, do very complex collaborations, right? Oftentimes it does include students with teachers to do a particular experiment, a research project. So good communication is fundamental, right? Results have no impact until shared with a community. If you're going into academia and you want to do research, it's pointless to do groundbreaking research if you don't share it to the public, if you don't share it with the wider scientific community. That's where academic journals come in and conferences come in and symposiums and all these forms to share information, right? And generally, academic journals, you would submit a manuscript and it will get peer reviewed, right? Other scientists in your field, experts in the field will come in and they review your work to see if it's scientifically sound and whatnot, and you'll get published if it is accepted. Okay. Scientific work often are checked by others and repeated by others. Definitely the ability to repeat your work is important. If it cannot be repeated, then there is a failure in the claim. Okay, it has to be repeated, reproducible. Integrity and adherence to high professional standards. We are all obligated as scientists to report the truth, right? To report your data as a whole untouched, manipulated, right? If you do that and you get found out, that is basically your career as a scientist is over. Okay. Don't do that ever. So scientists often use model organisms to collaborate. Sometimes it is quite difficult to do a particular study, especially with humans, right? If you want to do, for example, medical science studies on particular new medicines, right? Drugs, you would likely do it on mice, so being very similar in structure and organs, right? Being mammals, but uh, biology has many model organisms to work with, right? The fruit fly, Drosophila melanogaster, how genes work even for humans, many things were discovered on development just by using the fruit fly. Mustard plants, or Arabidopsis thaliana, inheritance patterns, right? Soil worm C. elegans, D. rerio for zebrafish, E. coli. Oh my goodness, is so fundamental for studies on how genes work also. And of course, the mouse, right? So all these are models that scientists can use to do a particular study that you don't necessarily have to use humans, right? There's a lot of ethical conditions there and so forth. Uh, Very famous quote of Isaac Newton, to explain all nature is too difficult a task for any one man, or even for any one age. 'Tis much better to do a little with certainty and leave the rest for others that come after you. Right? Very specific steps, very specific things that scientists focus on and share the knowledge. Okay. And lastly, for this chapter, science, technology, and society, right? So, the goal of science ultimately is to understand natural phenomena. The goal of technology is to apply scientific knowledge for some specific purpose, usually some benefit to the human livelihood, right? But they're both interdependent. As you make more breakthroughs in science, we use the theory to produce more effective technology to make even more breakthroughs. So they're interrelated, they're interdependent there. Combination of both have significant impact on society in general, right? Like the discovery of DNA. Discovering DNA has led to applications in biotechnology, DNA manipulation, and DNA manipulation, right? Not just in medicine, but in agriculture and forensics, right? DNA sequencing and profiling, transgenesis, making plants more effective in growth, more nutritive. Okay, so the direction of technology depends on the necessity of people and the social environment. There are a lot of ethical debates, right? Should we do a particular thing only because we could do it? Should we do it? Right. And another, kind of emphasis point, DNA technology and heritable diseases, right? Could it be a source for bioethics, right? Monitoring their unethical behavior there. Should it be mandatory to be used in particular patients, right? Or should voluntary testing be done? Okay. So should and some other ethical, very important, should insurance companies have access to medical background to individuals that are applying? So these are things that are still under debate, right? So all individuals have a responsibility to be informed about how science works and the potential risks and benefits of technology. Okay, and it is important to be um, um, knowledgeable about science in general, even if you're, not if that isn't your particular field, right, or career. It is important to know about science and how science works. Okay. Many technological innovations with profound impact originated in settlements along trade routes. A mix of different cultures ignited new ideas. So that's quite interesting how you're getting uh, people from different backgrounds to create new things. The printing press was done from China, that was already masterful on paper and ink. So science doesn't discriminate. It benefits from diversity in background and viewpoints. The more voices that are heard at the table, the more robust, valuable, and productive the scientific interchange can be and will be, right? Unfortunately, it does happen until still today. Women, people of color, and race and ethnic groups are underrepresented, and they can be sometimes a minority, right? So we need to break that boundary also. Okay. So with that, we finished chapter 1. Here's a glimpse of the chapter review. Okay. And in the next video, I'll continue with chapter 2. If you would like to have a video on the chapter review questions so we can discuss, I may do that if enough people are interested. Okay. Concept review here. I kind of just skim it through for you guys to see.